Asterisk, a regular traffic stop turned into something no one expected. When a local cop stopped a quiet man on a calm street, he thought it would be another easy power trip. But within minutes, the situation flipped because the man wasn't just a random driver. He was someone with far more power, and a badge that outranked them all. Peaceful Tuesday morning in the quiet neighborhood of Glenwood Hills. The sun had just risen, casting a warm golden light across the rooftops and sidewalks. Kids waited at bus stops with backpacks. Parents sipped their morning coffee, and joggers passed by with music in their ears. Among the gentle flow of traffic was a sleek black SUV driving slowly through the area. It wasn't speeding or making sudden moves, just moving cautiously, as if the driver was carefully observing his surroundings. Inside the car sat a man in his early 40s. He wore a plain gray suit, dark sunglasses, and had a calm, quiet presence about him. His hands rested on the wheel, steady and relaxed. He took a sip of his coffee at each stop sign, patiently waiting before moving again. Nothing about him seemed suspicious, but sometimes appearances mean little when egos get involved. A police cruiser, parked at the corner of the next block, suddenly pulled out and began following the SUV. Its lights stayed off at first, just trailing the black vehicle for a few blocks. The man noticed in his rearview mirror but didn't panic. He continued driving exactly as he had been, smooth and by the book. Then, without warning, the red and blue lights flashed behind him. The man gave a soft sigh and slowly pulled over to the curb, careful not to block any driveways. As the engine idled, he reached into his glove box for his registration and rolled down the window. The officer behind him stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his belt and sunglasses, and approached with a certain swagger in his walk. The man in the SUV waited calmly, his expression unreadable. He had been stopped before, but something about this officer's approach already told him this encounter might not be routine. As the officer neared the window, hand resting on his hip, the neighborhood around them carried on as usual, completely unaware that something unexpected was about to unfold right there on that quiet morning street. As the officer reached the driver's window, his tone was sharp and impatient. Without greeting or explanation, he said, "License and registration, now." The man in the SUV looked up calmly, his face unreadable. Behind his sunglasses, he handed over both documents without hesitation, then politely asked, "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" The young cop, standing tall with a puffed chest, scoffed and said, "You were driving too slow, acting suspicious. This isn't a place for people to cruise around like they're spying on someone." The man didn't react, simply nodded and remained silent. The officer looked over the license and furrowed his brow, clearly not recognizing the name but scanning it with suspicion. "Where are you headed? Why are your windows so dark? Where's your front license plate?" he continued, firing off questions without waiting for answers. The man finally spoke, his voice calm and even. "I'm going to a meeting downtown. The windows are legal. The front plate is inside the car. I had it removed temporarily for vehicle maintenance." The officer didn't seem satisfied. He glanced inside the vehicle, trying to spot anything unusual. "You from around here?" he asked, tilting his head. "Not exactly," the man replied. "I work in federal law enforcement." The officer snorted and laughed. "Oh really, you guys love saying that. What are you? Security? You don't look like anything special." The man gave a small smile and didn't answer. He didn't need to. The officer clearly wasn't interested in listening anyway, only in asserting control. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered suddenly. The man didn't move, just looked straight ahead. "Is that necessary, sir?" he asked. "You're acting nervous," the officer snapped. "That's enough reason for me." Around them, the street was quiet, and no one seemed to notice what was happening. But inside that SUV, tension began to rise. The officer had no idea who he was talking to, and the man behind the wheel was quietly deciding whether to let things play out, or to end a charade before it went too far. The man in the SUV took a deep breath and slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing a calm but focused gaze. He looked directly at the officer and said firmly, "Sir, I assure you there is no need for this. I haven't broken any laws." But the young officer wasn't interested in calm explanations. His tone grew louder. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he barked. "I asked you to step out of the vehicle. Do it now, or I'll make you." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached slowly into his inner jacket pocket. The officer immediately placed his hand on his holster and shouted, "Hands where? I can see them." The man froze. "Relax," he said in a steady voice. "I'm just getting my identification." He carefully pulled out a slim black wallet, flipped it open, and held it up through the window. Inside was a badge and an official ID card. The gold letters were unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The officer leaned in to look, and for a second, his face lost color. "Wait, you're FBI," he stammered. "Yes," the man replied simply. "Special Agent Daniel Reed, and I'd appreciate it if we could now have a professional conversation." The officer stepped back, clearly shaken, but trying to hold his authority. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he muttered. Agent Reed calmly responded, "I did. You laughed it off. I wanted to give you the chance to handle this properly." Embarrassment washed over the officer's face. He looked around, hoping no one was watching, but of course, someone was. Another unmarked vehicle had pulled up behind the patrol car, and two men in suits stepped out, walking toward them. The officer stood frozen as the taller of the two men said, "Everything all right here, Agent Reed?" The young cop stepped aside in silence. He had just tried to intimidate an FBI agent, and now others had shown up. His pride quickly faded. Agent Reed looked at the officer once more, his expression calm. "Next time, listen before assuming." And with that, the balance of power shifted completely. The two men in suits approached quickly but calmly. Their posture was sharp and their movements confident, clearly professionals. One of them gave Agent Reed a nod and asked, "Do you need backup?" Reed shook his head slightly. "No, Agent Lewis, just a misunderstanding." The young police officer stepped back, suddenly aware that he was out of his depth. His earlier arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by a mix of confusion and embarrassment. He looked at the men surrounding him and realized that every single one of them was federal. He had just tried to pull rank on a senior FBI agent and now, two more had appeared. I didn't know who you were," the officer muttered, trying to save face. Agent Lewis raised an eyebrow. "That shouldn't matter," he said. "Everyone deserves respect, badge or not." The words hit harder than the officer expected. He nodded awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. Agent Reed handed back the officer's pen and ID clipboard, which he had taken earlier to fill in a form the officer never explained. "You might want to review protocol, especially when dealing with traffic stops," Reed said, still composed. "Not everyone's out to get you, and not every slow driver is a criminal." Behind them, neighbors had begun peeking out windows, sensing something serious had happened. But Agent Reed kept things calm. "We're not here to cause a scene," he added, "but next time, be sure before you act like this again." The officer nodded again, his face red, unable to come up with a response. Agent Reed looked at him once more, not with anger but with disappointment. Then he turned to get back in his SUV. The two other agents returned to their car without another word. As the FBI vehicles pulled away, the officer stood on the sidewalk, quiet and still. The same street that was calm earlier now felt heavier with reality. In less than 10 minutes he had gone from feeling powerful to feeling exposed, and now he understood. Respect is earned, but more importantly it should be given, especially when you least expect who you're dealing with. Asterisk as the black SUV disappeared down the street. The officer remained standing by his patrol car, completely silent. The rush of adrenaline had faded, replaced by a sinking feeling in his chest. He had made a fool of himself, not just by stopping a man without cause, but by treating someone with disrespect and arrogance. And it didn't matter that the man was an FBI agent. What mattered was that he had acted on assumption, not reason. He replayed the entire moment in his mind, how he'd barked orders, mocked the man, ignored the calm warnings, and let his badge get to his head. The other agents hadn't shouted, threatened, or flexed power. They had stayed calm, professional, and firm. That stung more than anything. The officer realized now how different true authority looked. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet, confident, and always in control. A senior officer from his own department later arrived, having heard about the stop from dispatch. After a brief conversation, the young officer admitted what had happened. To his surprise, the senior officer didn't scold him, but instead said something that stuck with him. "The badge gives you power, yes, but the way you treat people shows if you deserve it." That night, the officer sat at home thinking hard. He wasn't a bad person, but he had let ego take over. He had judged a man based on a gut feeling, not facts. He had tried to force respect instead of earning it. The next morning he walked into the station early, asked to review policy on federal interaction, and even requested to shadow a more experienced officer for a while. He didn't want to make the same mistake again. And deep down he hoped he'd meet Agent Reed one day under better circumstances, not to apologize again, but to prove he had changed. Because some lessons come from books, and others from moments that humble you in front of the people you least expect. That day on a quiet street had given him both. Days passed, but the memory of that morning stayed fresh in the young officer's mind. He didn't tell many people about the incident, not out of shame but because he was still processing the lesson it had taught him. For the first time in his career he understood how quickly power could be misused, even with good intentions. He had meant to protect the community, but instead, he had let pride cloud his judgment. Meanwhile, Agent Reed returned to his normal duties, but even he hadn't forgotten the encounter. He had seen officers like that before, too eager, quick to act, not enough patience. But there was something different about this one. Reed could tell the officer had been shaken, not just by the badge reveal, but by the realization that he'd gone too far. A week later, by chance, the two crossed paths again, this time in a local government building. The officer saw Agent Reed in the hallway and walked over without hesitation. "Agent Reed," he said, his tone respectful. "I want to thank you ... for the way you handled things. You could have made it worse for me, but you didn't." Reed nodded. "Calm as always." Mistakes happen. It's how you respond to them that matters. The officer smiled slightly and added, That started doing things differently, slowing down, listening more. I'm working on being the kind of officer this badge should represent. Reed gave a small smile in return. That's good to hear. There was no long speech, no dramatic handshake, just a quiet moment between two men who understood each other now more than ever. As they walked away in opposite directions, the officer felt something shift inside him. He hadn't just avoided punishment, he had earned a second chance to become better. And from that day forward, every time he stopped a car, asked a question, or put on his uniform, he remembered that quiet street, the calm agent, and the power of humility. The story didn't end with sirens or shouting, it ended with growth. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending of all. Asterisk if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Asterisk subscribe to Deep Wounds for more powerful and eye-opening stories every week.